Pay attention to what happens during quiet moments in conversations now. A pause appears. Someone finishes speaking, and for a few seconds no one says anything. Earlier in your life, moments like this often created a subtle tension. Your mind would immediately search for something to add. A comment, a question, a joke, anything that could keep the interaction moving. The silence felt like a gap that needed to be filled, not necessarily because you loved talking, but because the quiet space itself felt uncomfortable. Your attention would sharpen. You might begin wondering whether the other person felt awkward, whether you were expected to continue the conversation, whether the pause meant something was wrong. So you filled it. You expanded on your previous point. You asked another question. You introduced a new topic, and the conversation resumed. Most people do this without thinking about it. In fact, modern social environments often encourage it. Conversation is treated like momentum. If the energy slows down, someone must push it forward again. But if you observe your own reactions recently, you may notice something different. A pause appears, and instead of rushing to remove it, you remain quiet, not frozen, not anxious, just present. The silence no longer feels threatening. This shift might seem small, but psychologically it reflects a deeper change. Carl Jung believed that external noise often reflects internal uncertainty. When the ego is still stabilizing, it tends to assert itself frequently. It speaks, explains, clarifies, responds quickly, because expression becomes a way of confirming identity. When we speak constantly, we are not only communicating, we are also reinforcing our presence in the social field. The ego quietly asks a question in every interaction. Am I being seen? Earlier in life, conversation often becomes a tool for answering that question. You contribute ideas. You respond quickly. You ensure that your voice remains part of the exchange, not necessarily out of egoic pride, but because participation reassures the psyche that it belongs. Silence, by contrast, can feel ambiguous. If no one is speaking, the mind begins searching for meaning. Are they judging me? Did I say something wrong? Should I say something now? The nervous system interprets the pause as uncertainty, and uncertainty activates action. But as individuation progresses, the relationship to silence changes. Identity becomes less dependent on constant expression. The ego no longer needs to reaffirm itself through continuous participation. Your presence is no longer something that must be maintained through speech. You can simply be there, and that changes the emotional quality of silence. Instead of feeling like absence, silence begins to feel like space. A space where nothing needs to happen immediately. A space where thought can settle. A space where observation becomes possible. Carl Jung often emphasized the importance of inward attention during psychological development. When attention is constantly directed outward through conversation and reaction, it becomes difficult to notice what is happening internally. Silence interrupts that outward flow. It creates a moment where awareness can shift. You may notice the subtle dynamics in the room, the tone of someone's voice, the emotional undercurrent of the conversation, the way people respond to one another. Earlier, those signals might have been missed because the mind was busy generating the next thing to say. Now, when silence appears, you observe. Your attention widens rather than rushing forward. Another place where this change becomes visible is in social situations where people expect quick responses. Someone asks a question. Instead of answering immediately, you take a moment. You think. You allow the question to settle before responding. Earlier, pauses like this might have felt uncomfortable. You might have worried that taking too long to respond would make you appear uncertain. Now the pause feels natural, because the conversation is no longer a performance. You are not trying to prove quick intelligence or maintain constant engagement. You are simply responding thoughtfully. Carl Jung believed that individuation reduces the ego's need to assert itself continuously. As the deeper self becomes the center of psychological life, the urgency to express and defend identity begins to quiet. This quieting affects how you communicate. You may speak less frequently in group settings, not because you lack ideas, but because you no longer feel compelled to voice every thought. You allow others to fill the space if they wish. And if the space remains quiet, that feels acceptable too. This often surprises people who remember how conversations once flowed for you. They may interpret the change as withdrawal, or assume that you have become less interested in interaction. But internally, the experience feels very different. You are still engaged, still attentive, still present. But your participation is no longer driven by anxiety about empty space. The silence itself becomes neutral, even comfortable. Carl Jung believed that psychological maturity often expresses itself through stillness, not inactivity, but a form of inner stability that does not require constant external movement. When that stability emerges, the nervous system no longer interprets quiet moments as social threats. You can sit with another person without speaking. You can walk beside someone without filling every second with conversation. You can share space without needing to prove that the interaction is alive. And this quiet presence often changes the entire atmosphere of the interaction. Because when one person becomes comfortable with silence, the pressure in the environment decreases. Conversations become slower, more thoughtful, more authentic. People speak because they have something meaningful to say, not because the space must be filled. Carl Jung once wrote that the least of things with meaning is worth more than the greatest of things without it. Silence often creates the conditions where meaning can appear. Without noise, attention sharpens. Without urgency, words become more intentional. And as your relationship with silence changes, something else becomes clear. Your presence no longer depends on constant expression. You do not need to fill every space to confirm that you belong there. You can simply exist within the moment, quietly, calmly, without the internal pressure to prove that the conversation must continue. And that comfort with silence marks another quiet step in the individuation process, one where identity becomes stable enough that it no longer needs constant sound to reassure itself that it exists. Watch what happens in conversations when the rhythm slows down. Someone finishes speaking. The room becomes quiet for a moment. Earlier in life, that moment often carried a subtle signal. Do something. Your mind would immediately begin generating the next contribution, a follow-up thought, an additional explanation, another story that kept the interaction alive. Even if the previous statement had already completed the idea, you might still add something just to keep the momentum moving. Not because you love talking endlessly, but because the pause itself felt slightly uncomfortable. Silence created a question, and your instinct was to answer it. But something in your relationship with these pauses has gradually changed. Now the conversation slows down, a gap appears, and instead of reacting to it, you allow it. You notice the quiet without feeling compelled to remove it. Carl Jung believed that the ego often expresses itself through activity when it feels uncertain about its place in the social environment. Speech becomes one of the primary ways the ego confirms its presence. When we talk frequently, we reassure ourselves that we are participating, that we are visible, that we belong to the interaction. But when identity stabilizes internally, that reassurance becomes less necessary. Your presence no longer depends on constant expression. You can participate in the conversation without feeling responsible for sustaining it. This shift becomes visible in many everyday situations. Imagine sitting with someone after a meaningful exchange. Earlier, you might have rushed to add something else. Another question, another observation, something that prevented the moment from becoming quiet. Now the silence simply exists. Neither of you feels obligated to break it immediately. And surprisingly, the moment does not feel awkward. It feels natural. Carl Jung observed that much of human communication is driven by unconscious anxiety. We fill space not only to communicate ideas, but also to avoid the discomfort of stillness. Stillness exposes the mind to itself. Without constant expression, awareness turns inward. And for many people, that inward awareness can feel unfamiliar. Thoughts appear. Emotions become noticeable. The environment becomes more vivid. Earlier in life, these sensations may have triggered subtle unease. The easiest way to escape them was to speak again, to redirect attention outward. But as individuation deepens, the psyche becomes more comfortable with inward awareness. Silence no longer feels like emptiness. It feels like presence. Your attention expands rather than contracts. You notice details that once escaped your awareness. The shift in someone's tone, the hesitation before they answer, the emotional undertone beneath the words. Earlier, these signals might have been missed because your mind was busy preparing the next thing to say. Now the pause allows perception to deepen. Carl Jung often emphasized that individuation requires learning how to observe rather than constantly react. Observation reveals the patterns of the psyche. It reveals the subtle dynamics within relationships. But observation requires space. Without pauses, awareness cannot expand. When silence becomes comfortable, your role in conversations begins to change. You may notice that you speak less frequently in group settings, not because you have nothing to say, but because you no longer feel compelled to respond to every topic. You allow others to carry the conversation if they wish. And when you do speak, your words tend to arrive more deliberately. Earlier, participation may have meant contributing frequently. Now, participation becomes something quieter. You contribute when your perspective genuinely adds something. Otherwise, you remain attentive. Carl Jung believed that psychological maturity often brings a reduction in unnecessary expression, not because the individual withdraws from the world, but because their relationship with expression becomes intentional. Words become tools rather than reflexes. They appear when meaning requires them. They disappear when silence is sufficient. This change also affects how you listen. Earlier, listening sometimes happened while your mind was preparing a response. You heard the words, but part of your attention was already organizing what you would say next. Now, listening becomes deeper because you're not rushing to speak. You allow the other person to complete their thoughts fully. You notice the structure of what they are saying. You recognize the emotions beneath the sentences. This quality of listening often transforms the atmosphere of conversations. People feel less interrupted, less rushed, more understood. Carl Jung believed that awareness grows when attention slows down. Silence creates the conditions for that slowing. In quiet moments, the mind is no longer reacting automatically. It becomes receptive, curious, observant, and this receptivity often reveals something surprising. Many conversations contain more words than necessary. People repeat themselves. They expand ideas that are already clear. They fill space simply because the space exists. When you become comfortable with silence, you begin recognizing how much communication can happen without constant speech. A look, a pause, a shared moment of stillness. These signals often communicate more honestly than hurried words. Carl Jung believed that the deeper self expresses itself through authenticity rather than performance. When the ego stops managing every moment of interaction, communication becomes more natural. You no longer feel responsible for keeping the conversation alive. You allow it to breathe. Sometimes the conversation flows naturally. Sometimes it pauses. Sometimes it ends quietly. And all these outcomes feel acceptable because your presence is no longer dependent on constant activity. You do not need to prove engagement through continuous speech. You simply participate when something meaningful arises. And when nothing needs to be said, you remain comfortable in the quiet. This comfort often surprises people around you. They may expect the usual rhythm of conversation, but when they notice that you are not rushing to fill every pause, something interesting happens. The pressure in the interaction disappears. Others begin slowing down as well. The conversation becomes calmer, more thoughtful, more genuine. Carl Jung believed that individuation often reduces unnecessary movement within the psyche. As inner stability grows, the need for constant external activity fades. Speech becomes measured. Attention becomes steady. Silence becomes welcome rather than threatening. And gradually, you realize that conversation does not require constant sound to remain alive. Sometimes the most meaningful part of an interaction appears in the quiet moments between words. Moments where nothing needs to be explained. Nothing needs to be proven. And simply sharing the same space becomes enough. Step into a moment where a group conversation suddenly slows. People have been speaking one after another. Ideas move quickly. Comments overlap. Everyone contributes something, almost as if the energy of the interaction must keep circulating without interruption. Then the conversation pauses. A thought finishes. No one immediately continues. In the past, moments like this often felt slightly unstable. The silence carried a subtle pressure. Someone needed to speak. Someone needed to restore the rhythm. And very often, that person became you. Not necessarily because you were the most talkative, but because your mind quickly filled the gap. You noticed the pause and instinctively resolved it. A comment, an observation, a continuation of the topic. But as your psychological relationship with silence has changed, something else now happens in those moments. You remain still. You allow the quiet to exist. And instead of feeling awkward, the silence begins to feel strangely grounded. Carl Jung believed that the psyche expresses its stability through stillness as much as through action. When the ego feels uncertain, it tends to generate activity, speech, explanation, movement, in order to maintain its sense of presence. But when identity becomes internally anchored, expression becomes less urgent. The individual no longer needs to assert themselves constantly in order to feel real. And that inner stability changes how silence is experienced. Instead of feeling like absence, silence begins to feel like composure. You are no longer monitoring the interaction with the question, should I say something now? You are simply aware of the moment. Your breathing slows. Your attention widens. You observe the people around you. You notice the emotional atmosphere of the room. This shift reflects something deeper in the individuation process. Carl Jung described individuation as the gradual emergence of the self as the organizing center of the psyche. When the ego becomes aligned with this deeper center, behavior becomes less reactive and more grounded. The nervous system no longer interprets every pause as a signal that something must be done. Instead, the pause becomes part of the natural rhythm of experience. In many ways, silence becomes a form of presence. Consider how this affects the way others experience you. Earlier in life, constant participation may have created the impression of engagement, but quiet presence creates something different. When you speak less frequently but more deliberately, people begin to listen more carefully when you do speak. Your words carry weight, not because you are trying to command attention, but because your speech is no longer automatic. Carl Jung believed that meaning increases when expression becomes intentional. When words appear less frequently, they often become more precise, more thoughtful, more authentic. This transformation is subtle, but it changes the psychological dynamic of communication. Instead of reacting immediately to every moment, you allow awareness to deepen before responding. You listen fully. You consider what has been said. You speak when something meaningful arises. And if nothing meaningful arises, you remain quiet. Earlier, silence might have triggered the fear of being overlooked. Now it no longer threatens your presence, because you know that presence does not depend on constant activity. You can be fully engaged without dominating the interaction. You can observe without needing to intervene. Carl Jung often spoke about the psychological power of observation. When the mind is not busy asserting itself, it becomes capable of perceiving patterns that usually remain invisible. You begin noticing subtle dynamics in conversations. Who listens? Who interrupts? Who speaks from reflection? And who speaks from reaction? You notice emotional currents moving beneath the surface of words. These perceptions become clearer because your attention is not fragmented by the urge to respond immediately. Silence creates the space where perception sharpens. This is one reason many psychologically mature individuals appear more observant than before. They have not withdrawn from interaction. They have simply stopped competing with the moment. They allow the moment to unfold. Carl Jung believed that individuation reduces the ego's need to dominate the field of awareness. The individual becomes less concerned with occupying space and more concerned with understanding it. And this understanding often manifests as quiet attentiveness. From the outside, someone might interpret this as calm confidence. But internally, it feels even simpler. You are no longer trying to manage every interaction. You are experiencing it. Another interesting change appears in situations where silence once created social pressure. Imagine sitting with someone during a long pause in conversation. Earlier, you might have reached for a new topic to prevent the moment from feeling uncomfortable. Now the pause remains. Both of you sit quietly for a moment, and instead of feeling awkward, the interaction feels grounded, almost peaceful. Carl Jung believed that when the ego stops resisting stillness, the psyche becomes capable of deeper forms of connection, because true presence does not require constant speech. Two people can share a moment of silence without losing the sense of connection between them. In fact, silence can sometimes deepen that connection. Words often carry interpretation, explanation, performance. Silence carries authenticity. It allows each person to exist without needing to shape the moment through language. As your relationship with silence evolves, you begin noticing how much of modern life avoids these quiet spaces. Phones fill them. Music fills them. Conversation fills them. But when you no longer feel threatened by quiet, you stop needing those distractions. You can sit with your thoughts. You can walk without constant stimulation. You can experience the environment without immediately narrating it. Carl Jung believed that psychological integration naturally leads to this kind of inward steadiness. The psyche becomes less restless, less reactive, more capable of resting in awareness. And that inward steadiness begins appearing in your outward behavior. Your speech becomes slower. Your responses become measured. Your presence becomes calm. Not forced calm, not performative calm, but genuine composure. The kind that emerges when the ego no longer feels compelled to assert itself constantly. Over time, you realize something important. Silence was never the problem. The discomfort came from the belief that silence meant something was missing, that the interaction needed to be maintained, that your presence needed to be demonstrated. Now those assumptions have dissolved. Silence becomes another form of communication, a space where awareness deepens, a space where observation replaces reaction, and a space where your presence no longer depends on sound. You are simply there, attentive, calm, comfortable in the quiet that once felt impossible to tolerate. And this quiet composure becomes one of the most subtle yet powerful signs that individuation is quietly unfolding within you. At some point, you begin noticing something unusual about the way you move through conversations and social situations. You are not trying to fill every silence anymore. You are not rushing to contribute just to keep the interaction moving. You are not searching your mind for something clever or interesting to say simply because a pause appeared. Instead, you sit comfortably in the quiet. And the surprising part is that the quiet no longer feels like a problem. Earlier in life, silence often carried a different meaning. It felt like something had gone wrong. A pause in conversation could trigger subtle tension. You wondered if the interaction was becoming awkward, if the other person expected you to say something, if the conversation was losing momentum. And so you responded. You added a comment. You asked another question. You kept the energy alive. Not because you needed to dominate the conversation, but because silence felt uncertain. Carl Jung believed that when the ego still depends heavily on external interaction to confirm its presence, the psyche often creates noise to avoid confronting stillness. We speak quickly. We react quickly. We fill the empty space with sound. But as individuation unfolds, the relationship with stillness begins to transform. Identity becomes less dependent on constant expression. You no longer need to demonstrate your presence through continuous participation. Your presence is already there. And because of that, silence becomes neutral, even comfortable. Jung once suggested that psychological maturity often reveals itself through calmness rather than activity. When the inner world becomes more integrated, the nervous system stops interpreting quiet moments as threats. Stillness becomes natural. You can sit with someone without speaking. You can share space without needing to perform socially. You can pause before answering without feeling pressure to respond immediately. And that stillness changes the quality of your presence. Your words become more deliberate. Your listening becomes deeper. Your attention becomes sharper. Instead of reacting automatically to every moment, you allow the moment to unfold. This is why quiet presence often feels powerful rather than passive. People notice when someone is comfortable in silence. They notice the steadiness, the composure, the absence of social anxiety. Carl Jung believed that individuation leads to a personality that no longer needs to prove itself through constant activity. The individual becomes grounded in an internal center that remains stable even when nothing is happening externally. From that center, expression becomes intentional. You speak when something meaningful arises. You remain silent when silence is enough. And the absence of noise no longer feels like emptiness. It feels like awareness. Before we close, consider something honestly. Think about your recent conversations. Do you feel the same urge to fill every silence? Or have you noticed that quiet moments now feel more natural, even comfortable? Share your experience in the comments. Your reflection might help someone else realize that their growing comfort with silence is not social withdrawal. It is a sign that something inside them has become calmer. And if this video resonated with a change you've been noticing in yourself, share it with someone who might also be discovering that silence does not mean something is missing. Sometimes silence simply means the mind has stopped needing noise to feel secure. And that quiet confidence may be one of the clearest signs that your inner world is becoming truly stable.